Andrew Rimby. He is a PhD candidate in the English department at Stony Brook University. His dissertation, The Pool of Narcissus, Transatlantic Homoerotic Attachments, argues that Walt Whitman, Oscar Wilde, and other 19th century writers used ancient Greek allusions to express male homoerotic desire before the term homosexuality was invented. He's a 2019 Giuliano Global Fellow, a 2019-2020 Public Humanities Fellow, and a 2019 Stony Brook Graduate Fellow in the Arts, Humanities, and Lettered Social Sciences. So please welcome Andrew Rimby back. He's going to be taking us on a virtual Walt Whitman walking tour. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Jeff. First, can you just see me with the PowerPoint?
Yes, I would encourage folks, if you want to switch your view to speaker view, that way you'll just have whoever is speaking there on the little video screen on the right, and then Andrew's PowerPoint on the left. But it looks like there's maybe like a little box over the first slide here in one corner.
Okay. Let me see. That should change it.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was just your video, your face. I'll
got it.
change my setting. Okay, but well, as I do that, thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction. And I love speaking with the Port Washington Library. I counted before I came on today. I think this is now my fourth time speaking, second virtual time. I was grateful that I got to do 2 in-person lectures. As Jeff was saying, I do miss the coffee and cookie experience, but it's so nice that all of you get to join from such differing locations. So welcome. I'm going to go right into the virtual walking tour, which I've called the Traveling Bachelor in Huntington Village. I'm going to guide you through a few videos that I got to do of Whitman's Long Island, and there also will be a little brief section of Whitman in New Jersey. So I want to just draw your attention to what I always find to be a really beautiful image of Huntington Village. As you can see in this photograph, this is Huntington without any paving, right? We don't yet have planned sidewalks. It's by the famous photographer George Bradford Brainerd. He did many Long Island photographs. This is from the Brooklyn Museum. It was taken in 1907. So a little after Whitman's time. Whitman dies in 1892. And that's always an important date that I always remember whenever I'm talking about all of these different facts. So the most important dates for you to remember: 1819, Whitman is born. 1892, he dies. I also want to draw your attention. I'm not sure if any of you are Twitter fans, but I do have a Twitter. It's at Andrew D. Rimby. And please do feel free to email me after the talk, andrew.rimby@stonybrook.edu. And I also do co-anchor a podcast about academia, grad student concerns, and even performing arts, because that's another passion of mine. So I'm going to go on to the next screen. Okay. So I'll do the quick. I'm not sure how many of you know a lot about Whitman's childhood, so I think it's always important. This is my boilerplate slide that I always do with a Whitman talk. Whitman is born in West Hills, New York in 1819. Right in front of you, there is the farmhouse that is now the Whitman birthplace. Does not have the Whitman Mall across the street on the other. It would be on the east side of the house. There's no highway. But this was what the home looked like in 1920. It's the closest image I can get to when Whitman would have last seen the house, which eventually I'll talk about when I get to it in chronology, would have been in 1881. So his father, Walter Whitman Sr., sometimes we forget Walt is actually Walter. He changes his name. He doesn't want to be called Walter in the publishing realm. So that's why he changes it to Walt. Um, Walter Whitman, his father, was born to Puritan ancestors. They arrive in Huntington/West Hills. Um, if you lived in West Hills or you know about West Hills, it's kind of like Melville, where it doesn't have its own zip code. It doesn't have its own post office, so it shares a Huntington address. So his Whitman side arrives in the 17th century. His father is a carpenter and a house builder. So if you look at this photo of the house, Whitman's father actually designed the windows. Well, actually built the whole house. But if you draw attention to the windows, and if you ever go to the Whitman birthplace, which I really encourage you to, you'll see that the actual frame of the window is not a modern, it's not a contemporary design that you would have seen in the early 19th century. So Whitman's father was also inventing new ways to approach architecture. So that'll come in handy because his parents are very, though they might seem very traditional with their ancestry, they start to become very subversive in ways. So Whitman actually leaves this house. He's born in this house in 1819, but leaves right away in 1823. So he's 4 years old. Because his father wants to go to Brooklyn. Brooklyn at this time, just like this farmhouse, was mostly farms.
Andrew, I'm sorry
And
to interrupt you.
yeah,
So the slide is pretty blurry. I wonder, since you sent me the presentation, would you like me to share my screen and see if maybe the slideshow, then you could just prompt me to advance the slides?
yeah, let me
We just
try.
couldn't.
Sure, let me just see if this looks better.
Okay. Oh, much better.
Yeah, I think it's because I clicked off to optimize when I share the videos. So I'll I took that option off. Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Jeff.
Yep, no problem.
Um, so Whitman moves to Brooklyn. The housing boom that his father thinks is going to happen does not happen. So the family does not come into a lot of money. They're middle class. Well, we would call them middle class now. Whitman's mother also grows up on a farm in Cold Spring Harbor. However, the major difference is she's born to a Dutch Quaker family. Um, and that difference between the English Protestant side and the Dutch Quaker side will really start to um, inform how Whitman approaches even his poetry and just the dynamic of Huntington itself. Okay. So I wanted to give you the nitty gritty of what it was like to provide a walking tour in a pandemic, um, because I had never used Zoom before the pandemic, like probably most of you. I had never done a filmed walking tour. If I had done this walking tour, even with all of you, it would have been in person. So I'll explain what it was like just to get this off the ground. First, I did share, and Jeff has shared my PowerPoint with you, so please feel free to make use of it. And the Whitman Birthplace has a really excellent YouTube channel with free programs, and all of my walking tours are on the YouTube channel, but I include the link for you as well in each PowerPoint. So you can just get right to the walking tour. So here's what one of my still images of the walking tour looks like. When I was planning a virtual tour, the major difference between that and an in-person tour is, well, first, I knew it was going to be on YouTube. So I wanted to try to condense the tour a little more because no longer do you have those moments, just like now when I give a lecture virtually, we don't have those aside moments. So like a walking tour, if I'm walking from the Whitman Birthplace House all the way up to Jane's Hill, those are moments where you're going to interact with each other and not only listen to me the whole tour. Well, when I'm right doing a virtual tour, I have to narrate the whole time, which I'm very excited to do, but it does mean I have to have enough material that doesn't bore the participants. So I had to determine also what would work with the camera. And this is my first time doing it. So if you do watch the YouTube video, which I do urge you all to watch the full video, I think I add a little humor. You'll hear it even when I show you a clip of it, of some levity. But there are moments where my camera, my cell phone actually got so overheated that I had to find the shaded spots to get Zoom back up and running. That was not something I had anticipated. So you have to go with the flow, and you always learn that in the performing arts, to keep the show going. So I also was very careful to choose Whitman poems and prose texts that would speak specifically to each historic site. Okay, now you're going to ask, well, what are these sites on the tour that you're going to see? Okay, well, first, here is West Hills. For those of you who might not know exactly where it is, right? It's nestled, it's east of Woodbury, and south of Cold Spring Harbor. Woodbury will become important a little later on, so will Jericho. This whole area, I call it the Whitman perimeter, is really important to his story and his poetry. So first, I decided to go to the Peace and Plenty Inn, which Whitman would have known it as the Chichester Inn. It was built in 1680. Second, you'll see the Nathaniel Whitman House, which is built in 1702. I'll speak a little more directly about the importance of these homes. And then finally, my tour ends doing a trek. And I'm going to show you the excerpt of me actually moving up the hill. And I start to get out of breath because it is the highest point of Long Island, and for a reason. And you'll see exactly how difficult it is to actually navigate this hill in the current day. I also included for you done by Matilda Williams. The scholar Dr. Karen Carpenter has done a really nice pamphlet called Starting from Pominock, which is a tour of old Whitman land. So I urge you to look at that too. Okay. So I'm going to read for all of you the first opening section of Starting from Pominock. If you don't know, Pominock is a Native American name for Long Island. To the Native Americans, an Algonquin tribe, the debate is out on which Algonquin tribe it actually is. So I won't touch that debate, but the meaning is the land of tributes is what Pominock means. And then when Whitman started to use the word Pominock, he uses it to refer to Long Island as a fish-shaped island. So he also uses Pominock not only here in his poetry as the substitute for Long Island, he also signs some of his poems and some of his journalism off as Pominock. So he starts to use it as a pen name, which is very interesting. And if you have, I see some of you are adding questions, which is exciting. So yeah, if there's anything that I'm saying during this talk that you have questions with, please write your question in the chat. I'm just going to do this short reading. So I'll read it for you, starting from fish-shaped Pominock, where I was born, well begotten and raised by a perfect mother. After roaming many lands, lover of populous pavements, dweller in Mannahatta, my city, or on southern savannas, or a soldier camped or carrying my knapsack and gun, or a miner in California, or rude in my home in Dakota's woods, my diet meat, my drink from the spring, or withdrawn to muse and meditate in some deep recess, far from the clank of crowds, intervals passing, rapt and happy. We do get all of the other references to different states, but what I want to draw your attention to is we get Long Island right away. And you'll notice Whitman chooses to use the Native American term Mannahatta instead of saying Manhattan. Um, so he's very interested in preserving a Native American name legacy. I will get into, because I have to touch also upon when we get to the Huntington part of my talk, um, what history is not existing in Whitman's poetry and prose, because it's very important to talk about that as well. Okay. So here's a still image from my tour. I'm not showing you the Peace and Plenty Inn today, but this is where I really urge you to watch it in the tour. This is the Peace and Plenty Inn as it looks now. It's a private residence, so anytime I do any tour through West Hills, I have to be very careful because many of these buildings are private residences. And you don't want to you don't want to barge in on someone's private home. But as you see, there is a historic marker in front of the Peace and Plenty Inn. Most of these markers were done in 1992 to celebrate Whitman's centennial death. Okay, so the Peace and Plenty Inn is really important to Whitman because it's actually used, which was common in the 19th century. It was an inn that was used to house boarders, or most especially those who were going back and forth on this path to deliver goods. So Whitman would go out, even when he was living in Brooklyn, he would travel back to the Huntington area to see his grandparents because his grandparents were still living in their farms in Cold Spring Harbor and West Hills. And he would deliver produce back and forth to different stops on Long Island. So this inn served as a really good resting stop where he would have food and drink. It's very similar to, if anyone knows, the Maine Made Inn. I always love the pun of that name. And that is in Jericho. So that will also become important a little later on, but it serves the same significance as a historic inn. Okay. Okay, so here is a little ghost story because I've learned that everyone is always eager for some folklore. I am. Apparently, the Peace and Plenty Inn has seen hauntings. I can neither confirm nor deny because I've never stayed at the Peace and Plenty Inn. But you'll see that the patch has covered a ghost story that apparently Asa Chichester, one of the early founders of West Hills, who was part of why the specific road that I'm walking is called Chichester. It's named after this family. He's apparently been seen in the house. I have doubts, but you'll see that there is a lot of lore regarding his family. But I think what's most important when you read the story is this writer describes the specific historicity. So meaning the specific dwelling of the inn, like what it looked like. There's an attic space. You get a really firm sense of how it would have served as both a lodging place and a tavern. So it had both of those functions. Okay. In 1881, the Long Islander, which will become really important later on in the story, so I'm going to hold out on telling you what the Long Islander is right now. There is a story written called Walt, Whitman, and Huntington in 1881, and the journalist describes Whitman's last return to West Hills. He wants to see West Hills for the last time because he has suffered a stroke. He's living in Camden, New Jersey, and he wants to remember late in his life how all of his historic family's legacy looks in West Hills. And he also wants to visit his family's gravesite. So this is what the journalist is writing about. It's about his Whitman's um, cemetery. They were especially interested in the old Whitman burial hill and cemetery, containing the poet's ancestors for many generations, dating more than 200 years back, with its rows of ancient moss-covered graves. You might ask, how do I get to see this old Whitman burial hill? I have an answer. It's a double part answer. It's a two-pronged answer. The first is, you'll see I was able to photograph an image of the Nathaniel Whitman gravestone, which I'm very grateful for, because as you see, here is Nathaniel Whitman's house, built in 1705, around 1705. Another traditional farmhouse, built by the Whitman family. However, like I said, most of these homes are private residences. This is one of those circumstances. Shout out to the owner of the home, Rick Siebert. Thank you, Rick. He is the one who let me take a picture of the Nathaniel Whitman gravestone. It is in his backyard. So the old burial hill is literally up the hill in Rick's backyard. And Rick and his family are very interested in the Gothic haunting lore of the area of West Hills. He actually has a lounge chair, and I know he would let me share the story with you because he's given me permission. And he has lounge chairs set up in this burial hill, and he likes to have his morning coffee there. Maybe not in January, but he does enjoy the ambiance. And if any of you, I'm sure, you know that cemeteries used to be very popular picnicking sites, and still are, especially in Paris. The Père Lachaise Cemetery is very popular for picnicking. So the tradition lives on. Okay, before I show you the excerpt of my Jane's Hill walking tour video, it'll be about 5 minutes. Let me just get right to the important information about Jane's Hill. As you can see, here's a still image of me pointing out the marker for Jane's Hill. And everyone can access Jane's Hill. You can drive to it. It is nestled at the highest point of West Hills. So you can park your car there and take a walk. I am going to warn you, and you will see in the video, it is not an accessible path at all, by no means. I wish it was. I wish it was paved. It's not paved. And if any of you have any, networks where those who do preservation with hiking trails, this would definitely be a good advocacy project. It's the highest spot on Long Island. It's 401 feet above sea level. You will hear my breath in this video, and you will tell that it is 401 feet above sea level. It was originally called Oakley or High Hill. Like so much of Long Island, the name changes because of a prominent family, the Jaynes family. They were also early settlers of West Hills, just like the Whitman family, just like the Chichester family. Whitman speaks so much of why this hill. He doesn't call it Jane's Hill. Again, the reason is because it doesn't get known as Jane's Hill until after he dies. So, he just calls it the hill. This is his backyard. The birthplace is about a mile south of the hill. He would walk all the way a mile up to this hill, and I'm at the bottom of the hill, so you still have there's another about 15 minutes of walking once you get from the base to the top. He would draw poetic inspiration from the hill, and I think that that's a good place for me to show you what it actually looks like. Okay. So just bear with me. It might be a little glitchy. I'm going to warn you. You can hear it though, so that's important. But if it is a little glitchy, this is why I shared the whole tour with you, so you can watch. You'll see it rings in at 2 hours. So, sadly, I wasn't going to show you the whole 2-hour tour. Okay, so this is me almost at the top of the hill. And as you can see, this is what you have to work with when you're walking up the hill. I would call them ruts in the dirt. So I just want to make sure, Jeff, can you see the YouTube video right now?
Yes, I can.
Good. Okay. Perfect. So this will be about 5 minutes. The whole path. They're starting to they're starting to disintegrate, it seems. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Rochelle. If anyone needs a motivational workout, just listen to this later. We are doing it. We're okay. I see the rock. Oh, we're almost there. Okay. Wow. We're at the top. Okay, yeah, camera can sit. Okay. Okay, and this is the mother lode. This is one of, okay, I'll take my breath right now. Okay. Now I know what it feels like to be a professional dancer and then you have a singing number. Whoa, okay. So, this is Whitman's poem called Pomanak. And it's on a very historic rock. I'm not sure what the carbon dating is of this, but what's really nice is, I mean, sadly, there's graffiti on it. We see that. And you got a camera? Thank you.
Oh, we can't hear you too well, Andrew. Talk a little bit more.
Testing. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, I think something was covering the mic or something. Now you're good.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah, if you can't hear me again, just let me know. Thanks, Caitlin. Whew. Okay, so as you even saw, these paths are not maintained. If you all want to send letters to Huntington Township, please do, because that is not an accessible walk at all. However, we're at the rock. We are at the top of the hill. And this is really where Whitman gains his idea of, I think, at least, setting. And why do I say that? If Cameron, you want to do a little panorama? There's a lot of overgrowth. When Whitman would have come here, I always imagine he would have come with a book, probably a quill. I'm not sure. I don't know the history of the pen that well, but he would have, I think, come with writing material. The overgrowth was not here, so he would have seen north. He would have seen the Long Island Sound from Huntington Bay. South, he would have seen the Atlantic Ocean, which I guess, I don't know what beach that is, but I guess south of Babylon. So I'll read the Pomanak poem because it really cements that idea of how place here of the Long Island Sound and the beach, the Atlantic Ocean, stayed with him, because you would think, oh, Whitman would have written this in the original 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass. No. Sorry, I just wagged my finger in an admonishing way at Cameron. I didn't mean to do that to you. The Pomanak poem comes in 1888. For those of you who are probably questioning, didn't Whitman die in 1892? Yes. He writes this as one of his final poems. Not the final, but one of the final poems. Okay, so here it goes. Sea beauty, stretched and basking, one side thy inland ocean laving, broad, with copious commerce, steamers, sails, and one, the Atlantic's wind caressing, fierce or gentle, mighty hulls, dark gliding in the distance, isle of sweet brooks of drinking water, healthy air and soil, isle of the salty shore and breeze and brine. Well, something so special reading that right here, right now, especially during this time. I think it's that you all just saw, and hopefully the energy that Cameron and I have right now is transferring to you via this virtual platform. We just saw the Isle of the Sweet Brooks, the Long Island Sound, the Atlantic Ocean, but the mountain springs. Those are sweet brooks. I'll promote again my Laurel Springs tour because the crystal springs there, Whitman says in Specimen Days that Big Timber Creek restored him from his stroke. Okay, so that's a good place to stop. I don't want to give too much away about Whitman and New Jersey and Laurel Springs. So I'm going to get back into the tour. Hopefully that gave everyone, I know it did for me. It gave me a journey back to the summer, which I'm telling you, time during the pandemic is quite an interesting philosophical journey. Cameron, you kept hearing me reference Cameron. Cameron was my cameraman. Cameron Williams, thank you. Close friend of mine too. I also, for the tour, it was very tough. If I didn't have someone helping me, it would have been near impossible to try to navigate the hill. So I thank him. And the mountain springs that I referenced, because I didn't talk about that yet, there is a section on Chichester on the road that says Mountain Springs, and it was one of those myth, and maybe it's not a myth, but like Florida, that there's certain springs that restore your health, your beauty, and the same is true of what Whitman then describes as crystal springs in South Jersey. Okay, here's the poem. There's the boulder. Oh, and I should mention that when I shared with you all the PowerPoint and talked about Dr. Karen Carpenter's brief pamphlet of different information about these historic sites, there's one that she actually dedicates to the boulder. So if you're really interested in why is it a boulder, it has to do with a coastal survey that was taken right up at the top of the hill. There used to be a coast guard station there. That no longer is there. Okay, so I called this From Childhood to Adulthood. We are now heading to 1849. Whitman is a journalist at this point. He writes a series of, we could call them journal essays, letters from a traveling bachelor. This is actually what the LIRR train looked like in the 1840s. Quite different. Whitman writes extensively about the Long Island Railroad. You could say he's obsessed, but he is one of the LIRR's most dedicated travelers. So I'll read this short quote. He says, "We left the roofed and roomy depot, one might almost call it grounds of the Long Island Railroad, at the South Ferry just 5 minutes after the 9:30, which is advertised as the starting time, November 4, 1849. At first, I thought South Ferry meant Manhattan. No, South Ferry was actually, there was a station in Brooklyn Heights called South Ferry. So that's where Whitman begins his travel in these letters. And then he describes every point that he passes on the Long Island Railroad. So I'm going to take us there. This is Hicksville train station in the late 19th century. Whitman passes through Brooklyn, writes a lot about the Jamaica train station. The Jamaica train station was, like it still is, a hub. The Hempstead station, and he writes a lot about Hicksville. Okay, some quick information about Hicksville. And sometimes I have someone at one of these talks who's from one of these towns, and I love the insider knowledge you have. So if you are from one of these towns, feel free to promote your town. So on the left, and thank you, Hicksville Library, right? They have access to this image. Elias Hicks, 1748 to 1830. He was really known as a Quaker preacher. He did a lot of lectures in Brooklyn. Who was one of his fans? You guessed it, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman heard many of his lectures when Whitman was very young and in Brooklyn, and his father would take him to a lot of Quaker lectures, labor lectures, and another lecturer he really liked was Francis Wright, who was a Scottish philosopher who advocated for women's suffrage and labor rights. Okay, so the reason Hicksville is because of the Hicks family. It actually is named after Valentine Hicks, who also becomes the second president of the LIRR. You'll see him on the right. He is Valentine Hicks is the son-in-law of Elias Hicks. He had given a lot of money to develop the farmland in what is now Hicksville for a planned community, hence named Hicksville. Next stop, Farmingdale. From Farmingdale to Huntington Village. Okay, so Whitman says this about Farmingdale. At Farmingdale, you begin to come among the more peculiar specimens of humanity, which good old Long Island produces. So for Whitman, I always find it fascinating because we don't always think of Whitman as an expert in surveying, but he is. He becomes an expert in topography here and architecture. It's very fascinating. He experiments with a lot of different disciplines. This is what he says about, so the reason Farmingdale is so important here is because it's the end of the line for him on the train, because he's trying to get to see his family in West Hills. So what would happen? He would get off at here, the Farmingdale station, and then he would take a stagecoach north to West Hills. There was not a Huntington train station yet, like there is now. That comes later in the late 1800s. So he says this about Huntington. On the north side, so north of Farmingdale, off against the same quarter is Huntington, one of the prettiest villages of the island. The township of Huntington is a Democratic banner town. Okay, I didn't necessarily know what a banner town was when I read that. I've done more research. A banner town just means a very civically engaged municipality. Okay, giving from 5 to 800 majority. Nigh at hand are the pleasant villages of Cold Spring and Oyster Bay. Again, Whitman was really interested in Cold Spring Harbor because of his mother's side, and knew all of the, you'll find he knows all of the revolutionary history that happened in these towns, because these are very prominent revolutionary towns. The North Shore, as I'm sure most of you know, houses the Washington Spy Trail, 25A. I still have to watch that series too, Turn. Someone always recommends it to me. Okay, so this is what I think is so necessary to speak about, which is the early history of Huntington Village. So the earliest residents of today's Huntington were Matinecock Indians. The native population settled near the waterfront in Cold Spring Harbor, Huntington, Centerport, and Crab Meadow. I included the Matinecock Tribal Nation website. It's very important, I think, to recognize that everything we're discussing right now is based off of an idea around settler colonialism. So, who was actually living in this land before Whitman's ancestors on his father's side came to Long Island? The Native Americans. And on the left is the Matinacock tribe from the 20th century. On the right is very current. There is now a Matinacock Way. I think it's in Little Neck or in Flushing. I think it's Little Neck, though. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You can correct me if I'm wrong with any of this information, of course. But as we now know, we have the town Matinacock on Long Island, named right after the tribe. So it's very important, I think, because Whitman does reference the Native Americans, but he does it in a very passing way. Like they were living here, but doesn't really talk about, well, where did they go? And sadly, I'll tell you where the Matinacock tribe went. The Old First Church, built in 1665. We're now in Huntington Village. Mostly everything I talk about in Huntington Village is on what is Main Street. The main thoroughfare, the one that gets the most congested. It is a Presbyterian church, and it was the founding church for the for the Protestant community of Huntington. However, what did this Presbyterian church bring with them? Well, we have to acknowledge in 1626, Dutch merchants brought the first group of enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam, the Dutch name for New York. When the English took control of the colony in 1664, they made New York a hub of the slave trade. Okay. So, you might be asking, how does this all connect to Whitman? Well, the truth. I'm going to say the truth. Whitman also writes about this in Specimen Days, his autobiography in 1882, so you can look it up. He talks about a slave he knew named Old Mose. Old Mose was a slave in the Whitman family, who Whitman does say is freed, because if you know, on Long Island, slavery gets abolished in the 1790s. However, Whitman does acknowledge his family had multiple slaves. His ancestors did. And Whitman struggles with how to talk about this in his writing. And, I think we're still acknowledging right now, we need to talk about settler colonialism and the legacy of slavery in America. So that's why I really draw attention to this, because yes, the Presbyterian community starts to build these very large, as you can see on the right, a very traditional colonial house. However, who was serving in these homes? Slaves. Who were helping to work on the farms? Slaves. Eventually, they do become freed. Eventually, they do start to get paid. But this is a legacy that exists on Long Island. Okay, so now that that's all in your head, I'm going to show you an excerpt from my Huntington Village tour. A little longer. I'm going to take you to, I'll show you first what it is. It's called Huntington's Old Burying Ground, and it is on the highest point of Huntington Village. And I'll talk a little about who's buried there. So just give me about 30 seconds. I'll get this up for everyone. Okay. Okay. Get to 32 minutes. There we go.
Stabilizers messed up.
Oh, and I want to shout out to my mom because she was acting as the camera person. And once in a while, my voice goes in and out of the video.
Okay.
So
we are
we're
now at the old burying ground. And can you hear me better, Caitlin?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, good. Okay. So I'm actually going to get to a quieter part of the burying ground, which has some historic markers, which will actually explain who's buried here. And what I really want to draw importance to as well is the Native Americans who had been living here, and who actually there is a section of the cemetery dedicated to the Native American tribes, as well as the freed Black community of the 1800s, but also some very, very historic Black writers, especially I'll talk about Jupiter Hammond. He's very important to the history of Huntington. Okay, so I'll show you a view, though. I can't leave here without the view. And this building right here was the old town hall, which they're now partially demolished. It's partially demolished, but it's going to be, I heard from a friend, part of the Hilton Hotel. But they're keeping this historic section of the building for the lobby. But that's a rumor, so I can neither verify, I can't verify all of that information. So that's speculation. Okay, so we're gonna continue down. And we're going to now go to what's now called the Soldiers and Sailors Museum. Yeah, be careful. And word to the wise, if you ever walk right near here, the sidewalks are very uneven, so please be careful. I just never want to be liable for anyone. Oh, there you go. There's the front of the Huntington Town Hall. And actually, no, it's not partially demolished. They're just doing, I think they're renovating the interior. There you go. Okay, so this is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Building from 1892. It now houses the History and Decorative Arts Museum. I've actually never gotten a chance to go inside, so hopefully one day. I don't think it's open right now, but hopefully eventually I can see what's in there. So we're gonna actually head to a section that you would not know exists unless you do some digging. So don't worry, I did the digging for you. Okay, so right away, I want to I'm not going to go right up to the headstone, but there's a tombstone dedicated to the Van Wyck family. So you can't get any more Dutch than Van Wyck. And then there's this really important plaque right here that says Huntington's Old Burying Ground. The old burying ground. Oh, and I never touched upon. Sorry. Why is it called Huntington? So important. It's called Huntington because of Oliver Cromwell from the 1600s, who his birthplace was in Huntington in England. So, well, that's one reason. But then, and if you remember, Cromwell became the Lord Protector in between royal fighting when the royal families were going back and forth in the 1600s. But then I also heard it was just named Huntington from a family who lived here named Huntington. So again, like a lot of this history, you rely a lot on speculation and oral histories that are passed down. But, okay, so it says here, it is unknown when the first burial took place here, but it's accepted that the site was used for burials since the founding of the town in 1653. So the earliest grave sites are concentrated on the eastern slope of the old burying ground. It says that the Jacob's Pillow filled stone markers were obtained and used locally over a span of 200 years. And then I really want to focus on this bottom section. Yeah. So it says that the old burying ground is racially integrated and includes a modest number of Native Americans and about 400 African Americans. Hello. So most of the African American grave sites here are marked with the Jacob's Pillow. So, this is the Jacob's Pillow. And the first African American resident of Huntington was brought enslaved from Africa, transported to Barbados, and brought to Huntington in 1657. And he worked as a bond servant among the white population, died in 1690. About 100 other bond servants from Africa are buried here among their masters. 100 of their descendants were either set free or in 1799 were born free. Because in 1799, slavery is abolished on Long Island. And then I want to mention history about Jupiter Hammond. So,
okay, I take a little break in here just because there's some people passing by. And just so you all know, I was taking a lot of precautions on these tours with PPE. So I'll explain right now about Jupiter Hammond shortly, and we're nearing the end. But Jupiter Hammond is known as one of the first Black poets of America. Well, actually, I think is the first Black poet of America who's published. He's born into slavery at Henry Lloyd's estate on Lloyd Neck, Long Island. Now, Lloyd Harbor, right? These names start to change. It's actually still there. The Henry Lloyd's estate, if you've ever gone to the park there, I think it's called Comset Park. Hammond was given access to the library and was educated with the estate owner's children and worked with Henry Lloyd in business ventures. Okay, the way that this is phrased, and this is I'm not trying to critique the person who wrote this, but that Jupiter Hammond was given access to the library, he's still a slave. I mean, he's still in a servitude position, and he's oppressed. So yes, he was able to publish poetry, but at the same time, he's buried in an unmarked grave on the Lloyd estate. So sadly, you can't even find his gravestone. But I think it's very important to remember that Jupiter Hammond is the first published Black poet, and Whitman knew a lot about Jupiter Hammond. Okay, Whitman and race sources. I'm bringing this up because it's very, very important, and it's where a lot of conversation in Whitman scholarship is right now. First, the African American Museum of Nassau County is incredible. If you've never looked at their site, please do. Whitman Noir is a full book of essays with scholars discussing and debating Whitman and racism, Whitman and how he describes Native Americans, Whitman talking about Black people in his poetry, and there is no one consensus. There's a lot of different opinions. I will point to Lavelle Porter, who is a scholar who wrote an incredible essay called "Should Walt Whitman Be Canceled?" Spoiler alert, he says Walt Whitman's poetry shouldn't be canceled, but this is what he writes, and I think it's very important as I start to conclude the talk. He writes that, "What do we do with old Uncle Walt now? May 31st, 2019 marks the 200th anniversary of his birth. There will be conferences, exhibits, readings, and celebrations of the poet and his work. I submit that this is not a moment for uncritical celebration of the poet of democracy, but there is no better place to look for nuanced critical engagement with Whitman's complicated legacy than in the work of Black intellectuals who have talked back to Whitman." Okay, who are some of these intellectuals? Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and you can go on and on. And I also encourage you to watch the Whitman and Race PBS special, which was very well done. So if you have any questions, I'd love to hear all of you, because this is something that I've discussed a lot with my undergrad students. I just finished teaching a Whitman in Conversation with Other Authors course at Stony Brook. And I brought in a lot of James Baldwin and Langston Hughes to actually talk back to Whitman and openly debate his poetry and prose. And I always say, even though I am a Whitman scholar, it does not mean that I am not critical of Whitman's stances on how he views race. And I think it's very important to be critical of these stances and how it reflects America and what it means to be in an American democracy, which is very timely right now. Okay, so this is the ending. So I ended the Huntington Village tour, and this plaque about the Long Islander is not in a scenic place. It is actually in a shopping center, but apparently this is where the barn existed, so that's why they put it there. It's right near the Huntington Post Office. So Whitman founds the Long Islander newspaper in 1838. He lives and works in a barn, this barn in Huntington, as the writer, the editor, the compositor, and the delivery person. So he's doing everything for the Long Islander. He's the only staff member. However, as you start to read about why he leaves the Long Islander and he sells it off to another family, is because he shows up late. He isn't getting work out on time. Whitman is very interested in meandering and walking, as you could tell. When it comes to him being on time, he's a poet. So, he's a very creative thinker. And it was, for him to continue working for the Long Islander was not sustainable. So that's why he sells it off. He writes that, "My first real venture was the Long Islander in my own beautiful town of Huntington. I was about 20 years old. I had been teaching country school for 2 or 3 years in various parts of Suffolk and Queens counties." Okay, when he says Queens counties, if you remember, Nassau County is not yet split from Queens. So he was working a lot in what is now Nassau County. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, him and Whitman and his teaching. I know a lot of people are very interested in that history. He says, "But I liked printing. I had been at it while a lad, so I learned the trade of being a compositor, and I was encouraged to start a paper in the region where I was born." Okay. We're ending in Laurel Springs because this is where Whitman ends his life. He ends in Camden, New Jersey, but here's a picture of Laurel Springs. This is Timber Creek. I'll read the quote he says about it. "Sometime after the war ended, the Civil War, I had a paralytic stroke, which prostrated me for several years. In 1876, I began to get over the worst of it, From this date, portions of several seasons, especially summers, I spent at a secluded haunt down in Camden County, New Jersey. Timber Creek, quite a little river, it enters from the Great Delaware, 12 miles away. With primitive solitudes, winding stream, recluse and woody banks, sweet feeding springs, and all the charms that birds, grass, wildflowers, rabbits and squirrels, old oaks, walnut trees can bring. I'm not going to have you watch part 1 with me, but I include the part 1 of my tour in Laurel Springs. I'm going to jump to the second section. So this is my last slide that I've called Where Whitman's Long Island and New Jersey Meet. This is the farmhouse, very similar farmhouse design to Whitman's birthplace. It is the Stafford family farmhouse in Laurel Springs, New Jersey. I know everyone usually knows where Cherry Hill is. So 10 minutes southeast of Cherry Hill. He writes in Specimen Days on July 29th. After more than 40 years absence, except a brief visit to take my father to West Hills 2 years before he died, I went down Long Island on a week's jaunt to the place where I was born, 30 miles from New York City. So now he's talking about West Hills. I rode around the old familiar spots, viewing and pondering and dwelling long upon them, everything coming back to me. On the other side of the road spread the famous apple orchard over 20 acres, the trees planted by hands, long moldering in the grave, my Uncle Jesse's. Ooh, I always find that such a macabre way of speaking about his Uncle Jesse, but quite many of them evidently capable of throwing out their annual blossoms and fruit yet. Why did I bring that up when I talk about Laurel Springs? Well, when you read Specimen Days, he actually is writing from Timber Creek. He's recovering at this farmhouse with the Stafford family because he needs a place to bathe in the springs. He starts to take mud baths in Laurel Springs. He's trying to recover from his stroke. He says that Laurel Springs is exactly like West Hills. It's almost as if it is the same place to him. And Jane's Hill, where he gets poetic inspiration, is exactly what Big Timber Creek does for him later on in his life. So this is where I advocate that the New Jersey and Long Island Walt Whitman, they meet together. And I'm going to just show you a short clip of what it looks like to be outside the farmhouse. And I encourage you all to watch. I have a playlist of the different videos of when I was at Laurel Springs. Okay. And I'll also say...
Okay, so I'm going to...
Okay. The reason that I was here too was this was in the summer. I was quarantining with my parents in South Jersey. So in the first video, I said this is only 15 minutes from where I grew up. So I wanted to take all that footage while I was there. So here is the Whitman Stafford farmhouse as it now exists.
Okay, so I'm going to give credit to Howard Nelson, who in the Whitman archive wrote a lot of extensive notes about Timber Creek. And see if you can see my face. So I'm not going to talk about Timber Creek yet because I'm not actually there. I'll talk still about the farmhouse. So he said that the Stafford farmhouse was on a rise above the creek, and you can feel there's definitely an elevated hill right here. And Whitman made his way down to it along a lane lined with an old rail fence that became a footpath as it approached the water. So he would have taken the train here from Camden. I will show you the train station, but it actually is no longer in operation. This was one of those areas where it became a bucolic place to vacation for those living in Philadelphia and Camden at the time. So what else about the farm? Oh, what I wanted to tell you too is in the 1880s, the Stafford family sold their part of their farmland, and they moved to Glendale. So they actually moved out of this house in the 1880s, but Whitman would have been at this location. So, you know, it still exists, it still stands. Thankfully, they preserved it in the 1970s. So, okay, let's head to the train station now.
Okay, well, we're not going to head to the train station. But if you have any questions, I'm so eager to see them all in the chat, and I thank you all so much. And I know for me, I really do feel, especially now that we're so isolated, that I have now traveled all around Whitman's Northeast. So thank you all, and I'm eager to hear your questions.